My name's John Walters. I'm an entomologist I live on the southern slopes of Dartmoor in Devon, and one of my specialist subjects is ground beetles. I got into studying these beetles several years ago now, and I went out looking for a particular rare beetle called the blue ground beetle. And this was almost thought to be extinct at one point in Britain, but it was found about 15-20 years ago by some entomologists just searching some of the woods on the southern edge of Dartmoor.
Well, I've been a naturalist all my life, and ever since I was tiny, knee-high to a grasshopper, I've been interested in insects. But it was only about 20 years ago now that I first got interested in beetles. There's lots of beetles in Britain, but there's not many books which enable you to identify them that easily. I was working for Dartmoor National Park at the time, and someone came into the national park who'd been studying this really rare beetle called the blue ground beetle, and I was really excited by this, seeing this fantastic beetle, and I thought, well, it'd be really lovely to find that myself. And at that time it was only known from one place on Dartmoor, and I thought, it'd be nice to go and have a look for that. So I went down to the woodland where it did occur, and it was a big oak woodland on the southern edge of Dartmoor, and there was lots of mossy covered trees, and it was very damp, which is what this beetle likes. So I thought, there's a bit of woodland near my home where that same sort of habitat. I wonder if the beetle occurs there. So I set about looking under rocks and stones and bits of wood, and started to try and find some beetles. It was quite hard work, I must say. And I remember that the beetle lived under dead bark. There was a suitable looking tree ahead of me. So I had a look under the bark, peeled back the bark, and there was a shimmering blue, metallic blue beetle underneath. Great big thing, 2 or 3 centimetres long. Fantastic. It was the blue ground beetle, and it was a new sight for Britain. It had never been found in this site before. I've been lucky enough to find 3 of these blue ground beetles this morning. Fantastic creatures. Now have a look at that. Beautiful metallic blue colour on the back. This beetle is a ferocious predator. It will climb up trees. It emerges as a nocturnal creature. It will emerge at night, climb up the trees, and then it will follow slug trails. So it will lock onto a slug trail, follow that trail up the tree until it finds the slug, and when it finds the slug it will lock onto it with its great pincer jaws, which you can see on the front here. It will clamp onto the slug, and then what it does, it actually injects the contents of its stomach into the slug and digests the slug into like a slug soup. Once the slug is killed, then the beetle will suck up all the insides of the slug. It's quite disgusting, really, but it's a very efficient predator. So if you were a slug and you saw that face there, you'd be terrified. It's a very, very rare beetle in Britain. This beetle only occurs in a few sites on the southern edges of Dartmoor and Bodmin Moor, and for many years it was actually thought to be extinct in Britain. It was first discovered near Tavistock in the very early 1900s. Someone found it there in a woodland. And then for many years it was not seen at all, and people actually thought it was extinct. So much so that at one point there was a reward given out by a magazine at the time for a reward of £50, which in Victorian times is a huge amount of money for someone who could rediscover the blue ground beetle. Today it's really only found in some of the very best, most prime woodlands, like this one here by the River Dart. It's a very specialist beetle as well, because it likes very damp places, but it also likes those places to be warm. So it likes warm, moist areas near rivers where there's lots of trees covered in moss, because its favourite food is slugs.
Hello, I'm David Bilton. I'm a lecturer in the University of Plymouth. I'm interested in beetles for a number of reasons. Also, I use them a lot in my research. I can answer a lot of questions in ecology and evolution by using these as model systems. I've got an arrangement here with this lens which allows us to make two-dimensional photos of a beetle, so you can see the whole individual specimen in focus at the same time. So if you've got a beetle such as this one here, you can see that they're relatively sort of arch, sort of dome, sort of shaped organisms, and if you take a photo at high magnification, it's difficult to get the whole thing in focus. What this allows us to do is take a series of photos at different positions, and then we can superimpose them all with a package on the computer, and we can see the whole individual specimen in focus at once. And this is the way we often illustrate these things when we're publishing new species. This thing here, this is a photograph of what actually constitutes a new genus of small water beetle which lives in deep water in riffles, in streams in the mountains in the region. This is another new species. This thing, the actual individual specimen, is about 1.5 millimeters long. This belongs to the most diverse genus of aquatic, that's a different, main group of aquatic beetle on Earth. It's probably the most diverse genus of aquatic insect. I think one of the main reasons I'd say beetles are important relates again to the sheer number of species there are and the range of habitats they occur in. So if you think about the sort of importance of beetles in a functional sense, they make a lot of the world's ecosystems work. So beetles constitute around half of all described species, and we're still finding many thousands of new beetles every few years. Hundreds of new species are described every year. These things are incredibly ecologically important, and if you look at almost all ecosystems on Earth, with the exception of the open ocean, these things function largely through the activities of insects, and in particular beetles. Ecologically they're extremely important. If you took beetles out of most of the world's ecosystems, those ecosystems would either collapse or change their function absolutely fundamentally. Many rare species, and many species of, if you look at the sort of historical data on many beetle species, there are numerous species which have declined over the last century, particularly in the period since the war, in particular associated with habitat change, habitat loss, associated with agricultural intensification. Beetles are relatively old. I think the earliest fossils are from about the lower Permian, which is something like about 280 million years ago. And some of the living beetles, there are still living beetles which are relatively similar to some of these old fossils. Although the majority of extant of living beetles are much more recent in terms of their appearance in the fossil record, the kind of groups we're looking at. Some of the earliest beetle types, there are still some representatives of them found today. There are many arguments as to why we should conserve things in general. If you want the sort of a kind of utilitarian argument, you can go back to what I was saying about their ecological importance. Many of the ecological services that we rely on as humans are performed by organisms such as beetles. From another point of view, I would just also argue that beetles are beautiful organisms which have a right to exist. These beetles here that look as if they're made of gold, they weren't like that when they were alive. These things were black, as many species are. And these are water beetles, and what we're doing here is we've coated them with gold, and it allows us to look at them at very high magnification under a scanning electron microscope. And what we've been doing with these, myself and an undergraduate project student, we've been looking at the sort of arms race between males and females during mating. If you look at the surface of females compared to males in many of these diving beetles, including this species, you find that the female is a lot rougher than the male. It's got much denser, heavier sculpture on its back. And it used to be thought, including the interpretation given to it by Charles Darwin, that this was to make it easier for males to hold on to them when they were mating. And it turns out that what it's doing, it's actually making it harder for the male to hold the female. It's potentially a way the female can sort of test how good the male, how strong the male is, and a possible measure of male fitness on how good he is at holding on. So a rough surface makes it harder for him to hold on. But what the males do is they've got a sort of countermeasure, and it's to have big suckers on their front legs and the middle legs. And what we find is that if we look at different populations of these species, we find that if we look at the female sculpture, the more strongly sculptured the female is, typically the more suckers and the bigger suckers the males have evolved in those populations to grab onto the female and to hold on. So there's this kind of arms race in that you can see one sex will escalate it, either males will have bigger suckers or the females will have rougher sculpture, and then the other sex responds by, in the case of the male, developing bigger suckers to hold on to a rougher female. And this thing can escalate until it reaches a point where, that presumably things like the sculpture and the suckers affect the beetle's ability to swim or do other things.
My name is Max Barclay, and I'm the collections manager of beetles here at the Natural History Museum. And we have here one of the largest and the oldest collections of beetles anywhere in the world, about 22,000 drawers of specimens, like the drawers that we've got laid out in front of you here. And we probably have about 60% of described beetle biodiversity. We hope to have some of the largest coverage of this diversity anywhere in the world. So as a result, we have scientists coming from all over the planet to consult the collections, to identify their material and to see the species that we have laid out on display here. Beetles are the largest group of organisms on the planet. There are 400,000 described species, and beetles are therefore essential in all terrestrial ecosystems worldwide. They are eating plant material, they're breaking down decaying material, breaking down wood, a lot of them are predatory. When you have that number of species and that number of ecological niches, then probably you were to take beetles away, most terrestrial ecosystems would collapse. Well, I was one of these kids that's been picking things up and putting them in matchboxes since before I can remember. And I was lucky that my parents rather encouraged it and put me in contact with people who were interested, and so the interest developed. And eventually, when I was about 13, I came into the Natural History Museum and I was showed the collections, and I thought, well, this is where I want to work. It was like being ushered into Aladdin's cave. Well, beetles have quite a lot of importance in societies throughout the ages. I'll just show you something to illustrate this point. This is a drawer of scarab amulets from ancient Egypt. And we're rather proud as coleopterists to have one of the only groups of organisms that's been elevated to the status of a god. The scarab-headed god Khepri in the ancient Egyptian pantheon was responsible for rolling the sun across the sky. Now the scarab is in fact a dung beetle. And what it does is it collects a ball of animal dung and rolls that across the desert, looking for a suitable place to bury it, where it will lay its eggs and the larvae will develop inside the ball of dung. Of course, beetles have some negative aspects. Some species are pests. Some species are very damaging to agriculture and horticulture. But it's an extremely small minority. The vast majority of beetles are minding their own business off in the rainforests and the forests of the world. Well, my role as the collection manager of Coleoptera is to manage the entire collection. And we have upwards of 300 visitors from all over the world coming to use the collections during the year. I have to interface this collection with the world. So effectively, we have this massive resource, we have this enormous amount of scientific information, and so that's what I have to do, is I have to promote the collection and to interact with the users of the collection on the collection's behalf, and to develop the collection, to get new material in, to make sure that it remains up to date in terms of the names of the species, which change, the identifications of the species need to be correct, and when we get new material in, I need to get it out to the right experts so that it can be identified and we can build the collection still further. And as they're identifying material from our collections, they're describing new species. The type specimens, the original specimens of those new species, will be deposited here in the collection. That'll make the collection even more relevant, and publications will come out citing the collection, which will draw attention of an even larger community. We've thought of ways of counting it, but it's very difficult. There are estimates that there are 70 million specimens in the museum. I've heard estimates that there are 8 million beetles. I've heard other estimates that there are 15 or 20 million beetles. We have a database that tells us which species we have and which drawer the species are in. So all of the 22,000 drawers have got a number, and upstairs in the database there's a list of which species are in which drawer. Well, my primary role is to manage this collection. I'm not employed as a researcher, I'm employed as a collection manager, as a curator. I do a little bit of research on the side because I'm interested in these organisms, and you come across something which is striking and new and fantastic, and you want to tell the world about it, so you can publish that. I don't know, there are beetle-like fossils going back more than 350 million years. It seems that a lot of the modern diversity was already present in the Jurassic period and onwards, about 180 million years ago. And by the time you get into the Cenozoic period, after the extinction of the dinosaurs, the post-Cretaceous period, you've got almost all modern families. You get an awful lot of artists and an awful lot of design that's coming to use these beetles all the time. The other day we had a Volkswagen in here making an advert which they were going to put on the American Super Bowl. And they scanned one of our beetles and made an animatronic beetle to advertise their new Beetle car. This is a drawer of beetles collected on the Voyages of the Beagle by Charles Darwin. Of course, he was a relatively young man when he went on the Beagle voyages in the 1830s, and his primary obsession was with beetles. Anyway, these are some of Darwin's beetles, and as you can see from the very small size of some of them, he was a true professional. He was picking up the very, very small stuff. The one with the red label on it here was only described as a new species in the 1970s, and it was named Darwinii. So that lay for 150 years in the collections before somebody recognized it as being a new species.
My name is Mike Morris, and I'm what you might call a sort of senior volunteer at the museum. I'm what's called a scientific associate. Now, weevils, I suppose, anybody who thinks of weevils thinks of them as pests. When I get asked about my interest in weevils, I'm nearly always asked about the vine weevil, which is a notorious pest and destroys houseplants in this country. But worldwide, of course, weevils are very important pests. One of the most famous ones was the boll weevil in America, which destroys the bolls of cotton. They are also the largest family of beetles, and extremely varied in their structure and in their habits. I just find them fascinating.